there's a pretty gargantuan beginning to this week's episode here. And by now, unless you live under a rock, I'm sure you're aware of what I'm talking about. We'll start with the Seahawks, and before I even get to the major part of things here, we'll go over a few different housekeeping things with their loss, with their win, pardon me, with how everything shook out for the Seahawks. They have the 16th overall pick in the first round of the upcoming draft. The rest of the draft settings and picks and the order will be set out after the Super Bowl. But at least in the first round, Seattle is smack dab in the middle of that. So it'll be interesting to see the mock drafts and who Seattle actually ends up picking with that. But how it is with every offseason, the team signed players to the reserve/future contracts. 7 of those players, all of them previously being on the Seattle practice squad: linebacker Levi Bell, nose tackle Matthew Goddell, running back Bryant Koback, who you see on your screen there, tight end Taylor Mabry, safety Jonathan Sutherland, wide receiver Cody White, and wide receiver Aesop Winston Jr., a couple local guys in there. Then we get to the obvious big piece of news in the Seattle sports world. Obviously, in the American football and Seahawks world kind of thing here, Pete Carroll will not be back as the team's head coach next season. The organization put out a statement on January 10th stating that he will become an advisor but will no longer be the head coach of the team. Now, that's where things get interesting, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But Pete Carroll, later in the day after that announcement had gone out, at a press conference, didn't seem 100% sure that he was done coaching, stated that he was still fired up. He was ready to keep coaching. He was jacked, as he said in his own words. And even just days before, he had said that he had planned and intended on coaching the Seahawks next season. His contract wasn't up until 2025. Later in the day, it was announced, well, not announced, but it was reported that assistant coaches within the Seahawks were told that they could pursue other jobs, as whoever the new coach is will have autonomy to pick a new staff. The Chicago Bears, have already requested an interview with Seahawks offensive coordinator Shane Waldron for their offensive coordinator job. General manager John Schneider, will have full control of the head coaching pursuit. It was funny. Pete shared a story back when they hired John Schneider that Schneider had no intel that Carroll actually had been hired first as the head coach, and he had planned on hiring a head coach on his own and had a notebook full of names. Now Schneider will finally get to be able to make those decisions and hire his own head coach. And considering the talent and the respect that this organization has, it shouldn't be a difficult sort of search for this team, as I'm sure there are multiple candidates who would be happy to fill in for this job. It'll just be interesting to see who John Schneider ultimately picks. So, I mean, as the banner says, what's next for this team? After seeing the win over the Cardinals, the tight win over the Cardinals, even in that win, there were struggles for this team defending the run, getting the run game started, and missing the playoffs. The Seahawks have only won a single playoff game over the past 7 years. It's not very good. And they haven't gotten past the divisional round of the playoffs since losing in Super Bowl 49 to the Patriots in that ugly fashion that I don't want to talk about. This is interesting. I know that there had been a lot of talk of wanting a big change, and we've talked about the big change, quote unquote, with the Kraken when they went on their 8-game losing streak. This is a different scenario entirely, but it's interesting. A lot of people called for the big change. They wanted Pete out. They didn't like that things had kind of stayed in, we were running in place effectively. Right, with this franchise. There was a lot of talent with this roster. There's still a lot of talent on this roster, but they weren't going to further heights. They weren't going deep into the playoffs. They weren't fixing issues year in and year out. The run defense has continued to struggle for years. Running the football hasn't really been able to get to the same peak it was since Marshawn Lynch was here. And one, that is Marshawn Lynch we're talking about. Two, there's the injury factors as well, but the balance of the run pass hasn't been there as it has been with Pete Carroll teams. Ultimately, on Monday, when Carroll met with Jody Allen, he was under the impression that he was going to coach next year. He said he competed really hard. I smile a little bit because of the word, talk about Pete Carroll, the word compete is just synonymous. To coach this team next year, but Jody Allen essentially said no. So we're wondering what's next, because the announcement from the Seahawks and themselves said that Pete Carroll would go into an advisor role, that his position would elevate into an advisor role. Essentially, it's saying, hey, man, you're not coaching this team anymore. Get into the front office. But doing it politely, of course, at least PR wise. It doesn't really sound like Pete wants to do that, whether it was that press conference that he held later that day. The next day he's doing radio talk shows. He doesn't sound like he's set on just being retired from coaching yet. He said that while he said that there isn't the ideal situation for him out there right now, which I don't know what the ideal situation would be necessarily, there was some thought that maybe he would come and coach the Huskies, which I don't know if I'd mind that necessarily. Um, I don't know. I mean, I would be happy with him going into advisor role just because of the positive energy that he's got. He's still, at his age, running around upbeat, running through whiteboards, chewing the gum. We got the Air Monarchs on every game. And he's obviously manufactured such an incredible culture. If you just saw the reaction from past players throughout his 14-season tenure as a Seahawks head coach, the love from all these different players. He even got Russell Wilson and Richard Sherman to talk to each other after they hadn't done that for years. Later that night, as Pete Carroll and a bunch of former Seahawks and current Seahawks went to Legion, the restaurant owned by Richard Sherman and Cam Chancellor out in Bellevue. They had a little soiree. Russell flew up from his home in San Diego to surprise Pete and Russell, and Richard Sherman talked. There's just was obviously so much respect from so many players: Justin Britt, Jimmy Graham, Gary Gilliam, just to name a few of a long list of players who shared their thanks. I don't know where he goes from here. It'll be really interesting because the wording and the lack of a firm answer about what he's doing next makes me think he doesn't want to finish his coaching career just yet. So it'll be really interesting to see what the decision is from here and who the Seahawks ultimately hire. They're expected to interview Cowboys defensive coordinator Dan Quinn. That might change considering the onslaught that the Packers had against the Cowboys this past weekend in the wild card round, and considering the deeper numbers where Dan Quinn's defense performs poorly against top-ranked offenses. And Ravens defensive coordinator Mike McDonald, who I don't think I'd mind. Personally, I would like to go for the big fish and go after Mike Vrabel. I don't know why the Titans let him go. I think you look at Mike Vrabel, former player, likes to run the football, strong, defensive presence. I wouldn't mind having that here personally. You've got a more talented roster than you did in Tennessee. So I don't know if that's going to come to fruition. That's where my hopes would be. There's talks of Dan Quinn, Mike McDonald, Dave Canales, amongst a few others. Virtual meetings with these coordinators can start taking place tomorrow, and in-person meetings can't take place until later into the playoffs. But that's going to be the talk of the town for a large aspect of things for the next few weeks. Who's the Seahawks' next coach going to be? Because we haven't had to have this conversation in over a decade. So it'll be really interesting to see how this plays out, whether it's who the Seahawks end up hiring and where Pete Carroll ends up going and / what he ends up doing. Because again, it does not really sound like he's set on just retiring from coaching now. Do I think it was the right move? At the end of the day, yeah, I think it was the right move. But it doesn't sound like Pete is ready to be done. And depending on who they're able to hire, is it going to be better than what Pete Carroll is going to be able to provide you? Is the grass greener? We'll have to find out. So it's not action green, that's for sure. So we will look over into some other team-related news here. Another person whose future with the team isn't necessarily certain, Bobby Wagner was named to the AP All-Pro second team. Wagner has been named to his 10th All-Pro team in his career. He's been named to the first team 6 times and the second team 4 times. He becomes the second off-ball linebacker to be voted 10 times to an all-pro team, joining Ray Lewis, the third linebacker of all time to do so, joining Ray Lewis and Lawrence Taylor, and the 15th player overall to be named to an all-pro team 10 times. 6 other Seahawks got votes for all-pro teams: Devon Witherspoon, Julian Love, Nick Bellore, Michael Dixon, DJ Dallas, and Chris Stoll, the long snapper. The Seahawks, with the regular season wrapping up, found out their 2024 opponents. There still might be an international game in here. The Seahawks might go back to London. It's been 6 years since they've done that. We'll have to see there. But those 2024 home opponents include, obviously, you've got the top of the list here: San Francisco, Arizona, the Rams. And then you go to the other teams. Buffalo, that's going to be a good game. Get Josh Allen here. The only time that the Seahawks have played Josh Allen was up in Orchard Park. Miami and that offense that sputtered out in the wild card round this year. In the freezing cold in Kansas City, Tua Tagovailoa, Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle. See that offense here. Hopefully the defense is fixed by then. The Denver Broncos without Russell Wilson. Potentially that move hasn't gone through yet. And Sean Payton. Green Bay and the Packers, who had an excellent game against Dallas this wild card round. Jordan Love, is he going to be the real deal in the regular season next year? Minnesota, what does that team look like? Will Kirk Cousins be back? And the Giants. I would say more, but the Giants have had their struggles throughout the course of the years. That might change next year. We look at the away opponents. Obviously, again, the NFC West opponents there. Seattle will go out and play the Chicago Bears. Will Justin Fields be there? Will it be Caleb Williams as their starting quarterback, as they've got the number 1 overall pick in this year's drafts right now, at least? The Detroit Lions, who had an emotional victory over the LA Rams last night to end off the Sunday wildcard games. Atlanta, what do the Falcons look like next year? They've got talent on that offensive side of the ball. Drake London, Bijan Robinson, Kyle Pitts. Is someone going to go into that job after Arthur Smith was fired and be able to figure out what to do with that bevy of talent? We go over to New England. Same thing with them. What does that team look like without Bill Belichick? They've got some players there, but that roster could look towards a rebuild. And then the Jets, Aaron Rodgers, will he be back to speed next year? Will he play next year? We'll have to find out. But that's what we've got there for the home and away opponents. Obviously, you've got to look forward to the upcoming weeks here with the Seahawks, with interviews, with special coordinators. Will they go after Mike Vrabel? That's my hope, but I don't always know what's going on behind the scenes. It's ultimately up to general manager John Schneider to make his pick for the next head coach of the Seattle Seahawks. So we move over here as the NFL playoffs move on, and there's not a lot to look at with what's next. It's more so looking at, those respective interviews.